Well, I've been assigned to talk about Keynes's economics. Keynes's stock as an economist rises in inverse proportion to the fall in the economic indicators. The Wall Street Journal often reminds us that Keynes is dead. Last November, writing in the New York Times, N. Gregory Mankiw, the Harvard economics professor and former chairman of George W. Bush's Council of Economic Advisors, found a well-worn passage from Keynes's masterwork, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, that speaks to our time. At the present moment, people are unusually expectant of a more fundamental diagnosis, more particularly ready to receive it, eager to try it out if it should be even plausible. But apart from this contemporary mood, the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slave of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. Well, Keynes himself is now that defunct economist. The Wall Street Journal knows that he's defunct, but fears that zombie-like he won't stay down. Mankiw too knows that he's defunct, but he sees a friendly ghost. My job is to explain Keynes's economics and its influences, and I leave it to you to decide whether Keynes is the living dead or Casper. There's not time, and nor would I think it suit this audience, for me to give a technical account of Keynes's economics. What I can do is note some of his central ideas. For Keynes, people are heterogeneous. Each is situated differently. Each has different tastes, different capacities, different beliefs. Yet they form society. And extending our reasoning from individual interactions to the whole economy is misleading. It commits a fallacy of composition. The quickest way for an individual to get from New Orleans to Baton Rouge is Interstate 10, but it's not the quickest way to get the whole population of New Orleans to Baton Rouge. A key fallacy of composition in economics is a false analogy from elementary exchange to the economy as a whole. Robinson Crusoe faces a microeconomic problem, how to do the best he can with scarce resources. The appearance of Friday presents a new but still microeconomic problem. Crusoe's and Friday's different skills and different endowments give rise to mutually beneficial trade. And there's never any reason other than wanting to enjoy sleep or a meal or a swim that they should be unemployed. In contrast, macroeconomics concerns a whole economy, say Friday's tribe, or for Keynes, Mandeville's grumbling hive of the fable of the bees. A Lincoln Navigator or a dinner at the Magnolia Grill is a dispensable luxury. But if enough of us dispense with such luxuries, the auto worker and the busboy go without their dinner. The gay of tomorrow are absolutely indispensable to provide a raison d'etre for the grave of today. Unlike Robinson and Friday, workers in a complex economy can be unemployed. The economy can operate at less than full capacity. Keynes was keenly aware that the complexity of the economy depends on the institution of money, which allows us to obtain goods from people we'll never know, living lives that we can hardly imagine in places that we'll never see. Crusoe and Friday may be selfish, but in an obvious sense, they work for each other. If they save by laying up stores. We too work for each other, but only indirectly. Directly, we work for money, and when we save money, and we do not demand the work of others. The process of my abstaining from spending leading to another's loss of income, and his abstaining from spending leading to still another's loss of income, and so on, is Keynes's famous expenditure multiplier. The multiplier works the other way too. Expenditure, yours, mine, the government's, gives some people income, which if they spend it, gives other people income, and so forth. The expenditure multiplier is the intellectual basis for President Obama's stimulus package. Keynes did not believe that the private sector always failed us, but neither did he believe that it always and everywhere found and affected every valuable exchange. It fails us frequently enough and for long enough periods that the economy sometimes runs cold and unemployment sometimes runs high. Yet Keynes possessed a self-confident optimism, or perhaps an arrogance, and he also thought that with a little bit of shrewd macroeconomic management, guided by Cambridge men, of course, the economy could run warmer and unemployment could be kept low. Then, through the miracle of compound growth rates, we would soon solve the material economic problem. The real challenge that he saw for the grandchildren of his generation, provided that the management of the economy was enlightened, was the problem of what to do with their leisure. This, I think, is the Keynes of Bloomsbury. The multiplier explains the process of getting into and out of trouble. But what started the trouble in the first place? Keynes's answer, and surprisingly it's an answer that is like that of the Austrian economists, who were often his most vocal opponents, is time and ignorance. The future matters to economic decisions, but we cannot know the future. Institutions have evolved to cope with time and ignorance, insurance, for example. As a chairman of 2 insurance companies and the author of a treatise on probability, Keynes understood insurable risk. The casino cannot predict each spin of the roulette wheel. The life insurance company cannot predict the day of each death. But the averages and their variability are known precisely. You take a chance on roulette, the casino calculates its return. Keynes would no doubt see the onset of our financial collapse as the result of an intellectual error, confusing uninsurable uncertainty, the uninsurable uncertainty of the valuation of mortgage-backed financial derivatives, with insurable risk. He illustrates uncertainty. The prospect of a European war is uncertain, or the price of copper and the rate of interest 20 years hence, or the obsolescence of a new invention, or the position of private wealth owners in the social system of 1970. Of course, he's writing in 1936. About these matters, there is no scientific basis on which to form any calculable probabilities whatever. We simply do not know. Well, for Keynes, a conventional response to uncertainty is better than paralysis. The necessity for action and for decision compels us as practical men to do our best to overlook uncertainty and to behave exactly as we should if we could calculate the prospects and the risk. Such a calculation requires a view of those prospects, yet they too are uncertain. And a sanguine temperament and constructive impulses determine our positive evaluation of them. If human nature felt no temptation to take a chance, no satisfaction, profit apart, in constructing a factory, a railway, a mine, or a farm, there might not be much investment merely as the result of cold calculation. Elsewhere, Keynes refers to the spontaneous urge to action rather than inaction as animal spirits. And he says, if the animal spirits are dimmed and the spontaneous optimism falters, leaving us nothing but mathematical expectation, enterprise will fade and die, though fears of loss may have a basis no more reasonable than hopes of profit had before. He doesn't put it this way, but there is an expectations multiplier as well as an expenditure multiplier that can turn a boom into a bubble or a slump into a rout. When the whirlpool of speculation destroys enterprise, when the financial bubble bursts, when animal spirits dim and the multipliers head south, businesses shut down and unemployment rises. Then what? Well, Keynes was an inveterate optimist with high animal spirits of his own. And he possessed a facile pen and an elegant prose style and access to high places. So he urged the government to action. The general theory is light on policy prescriptions. It is by no means the Bible of deficit finance and big government that critics who know it without reading it suppose. Keynes would rather avoid slumps than fight them, which argued for sound passive policies, especially monetary policies, to prevent emergencies. He would certainly have welcomed the automatic fiscal stabilizers such as unemployment insurance payments that rise as output falls. He did not care for heavy regulation of financial markets, but for disincentives to too rapid turnover. Generally, small disincentives would probably be sufficient, but in a whimsical vein, he suggested that perhaps the purchase of an investment should be permanent and indissoluble, like marriage, except by reason of death or other grave causes. Nor was Keynes an enemy of the price system, arguing against wage and price rationing in the Second World War, nor of the private sector. The individual or the businessman normally knows his own interest, and these typically coincide well enough with those of society. Nor was he a friend of inflation, warning in his prophetic Economic Consequences of the Peace against debauching the currency. Yet when the private sector misses its cue, when the price system fails adequately to coordinate, when the slump looms, Keynes advocates government intervention. He called it the socialization of investment. We call it the stimulus. He preferred not to use the simple expenditure multiplier to buy us out of the recession, but to use it to jumpstart the expectations multiplier, to buoy the animal spirits of private business so that their own additions to investment would stimulate demand. Keynes was not timid. President Obama's slogan, "The fierce urgency of now," would resonate for him. Conservative critics have generally hated this about him, seeing in it a kind of recklessness with respect to the future. His most famous quip, "In the long run, we're all dead," is offered as Exhibit 1 in his opponent's brief. But the quotation is taken out of context. Keynes does not hold up Aesop's gay grasshopper as our proper model, nor does he denigrate Aesop's grave ant. His point is rather that it is not much use to say that on average the temperature is mild, the sun shines, and the winds are fair, when summers burn, winters freeze, and hurricanes punctuate the autumn. Ant and grasshopper alike live or die in the short run, not in the average. Economists may be right about their analysis of the long run, but if they cannot say anything enlightening about the business cycle, they're not much use. There can be little doubt that Keynes would support macroeconomic stimulus today, but Keynes was always a skeptic and a contrarian. So let me end with Keynes' assessment of the early days of the New Deal. If you don't hear its echo today, I failed in my job. To Franklin Roosevelt, he wrote, "You are engaged on a double task, recovery and reform. Recovery from the slump and the passage of those business and social reforms which are long overdue. For the first, speed and quick results are essential. On the other hand, even wise and necessary reform may impede and complicate recovery, for it will upset the confidence of the business world and weaken its motives to action before you have had time to put other motives in place. In particular, I cannot detect any material aid to recovery in the NRA, that is, Roosevelt's National Recovery Act, which is essentially reform and probably impedes recovery, and has been put across too hastily in the false guise of being part of the technique of recovery."
Never know how close I am going to be to the page. There we go. That's much better. Okay. My charge tonight is to talk a little bit about the Hayek-Keynes relationship, and they're typically portrayed as intellectual rivals, evidently, and the differences are often juxtaposed in very broad terms, Hayek being the proponent of free markets, Keynes being the proponent of government regulation of the economy. Of course, there's a certain amount of truth to that broad picture, but the actual history is, as usual, more complicated, more nuanced. We saw it in some of the presentations tonight. As an historian, I feel I should also add it's usually more interesting. So I'm hoping to tell you an interesting story tonight about the Keynes-Hayek relationship. And the second